Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the Second World War. Picture this. You're crouched in a bombed-out apartment building on the western bank of the Volga River, frost creeping across the shattered windows like spiderwebs made of ice. Outside, the temperature has dropped to -30°C, and somewhere in the darkness, a Soviet sniper is waiting for you to make the mistake of lighting a cigarette. Your stomach hasn't seen real food in 3 days. The man next to you died 2 hours ago, but you haven't moved his body yet because, frankly, it's blocking the wind. This is Stalingrad in January 1943, and you, yes, you, are part of the German 6th Army, the force that was supposed to take this city in a week and instead got swallowed whole by history's bloodiest urban battle. You probably wouldn't last 5 minutes out there, and honestly, neither would I. But tonight, we're going to walk through the final months of these soldiers' lives using their own words, letters they wrote home, diary entries they scratched into frozen notebooks, confessions they whispered to chaplains who wouldn't survive long enough to hear confession again. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Are you in Berlin at 3 a.m.? Los Angeles at midnight? I want to know who's out there in the dark with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together.
You're not here by choice. Nobody chooses Stalingrad. Stalingrad chooses you, the way a Venus flytrap chooses a fly. 6 months ago, in the summer of 1942, you were part of the Wehrmacht's Army Group South, rolling across the Ukrainian steppe with panzers kicking up dust clouds that could be seen for miles. Operation Blue was in full swing, Hitler's grand scheme to capture the Caucasus oil fields and cripple the Soviet war machine. Stalin's city, the propaganda value alone made it irresistible to Hitler, like catnip to a dictator with an ego the size of the Eastern Front. But now it's winter, and you're learning what Napoleon learned, and what every invader learns eventually. Russia doesn't lose wars in the summer. Russia wins wars in the winter, when the land itself becomes a weapon, when cold seeps through every layer of clothing you own, when frostbite turns your toes black and your fingers stop obeying your brain. You're huddled in what used to be someone's living room. There's still a photograph on the wall, a Soviet family smiling at a camera in better days. You try not to look at it. You try not to think about the fact that this family probably died here, or fled, or is now fighting you from the rubble across the street.
The bunker you're in. And bunker is generous. It's really just a basement reinforced with furniture and corpses. Houses maybe 20 men from your regiment. You know most of them by name. There's Schmidt, the Austrian, who won't shut up about his wife's cooking. There's young Hoffman, barely 19, who still believes the Führer has a secret plan to rescue you all. There's Sergeant Muller, who's stopped talking entirely, just sits in the corner, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision, hour after hour, like a man performing a religious ritual. And there's you. Whoever you were before Stalingrad hollowed you out and filled the empty space with cold and hunger and a creeping certainty that you're not going home. The letters started arriving in German homes around March 1943, months after the battle ended, because that's how long it took for the mail system to process correspondence from dead men. Historians estimate that roughly 40,000 letters were written during the final weeks of the Stalingrad pocket before the surrender. Most were never sent. The ones that did make it out became some of the most haunting documents of the Second World War, windows into minds grappling with abandonment, starvation, and the slow realization that their government had written them off as acceptable losses. Professor Wolfram Wette, one of Germany's leading military historians, spent decades collecting these letters, and his conclusion is stark. The soldiers knew. They knew they'd been sacrificed. They knew Berlin was lying, and they wrote it all down.
Here's something that doesn't make it into most documentaries. The temperature inside your bunker is only slightly warmer than outside, maybe -20 instead of -30. Your breath crystallizes instantly. Ice forms on the walls.
Men sleep pressed together for warmth, and in the morning you have to check whether the guy next to you is still breathing or whether he froze to death while you were unconscious. This isn't Hollywood's version of war with noble last stands and stirring music. This is war as entropy, as a slow grinding down of human beings into something less than human, something that shivers and starves and stops thinking about tomorrow because tomorrow is a luxury you can't afford. You pull out your last letter from home. It arrived 3 weeks ago, back when the Luftwaffe was still managing occasional supply drops. Your mother writes about the Christmas market in your hometown, about how she's saving extra butter for when you return, about how the neighbors ask about you and she tells them you're doing important work for the fatherland. She has no idea. None of them do. The newspapers back home are still printing victory bulletins, still showing maps with confident arrows pointing east. Goebbels' propaganda machine is working overtime to hide the fact that an entire army is being erased from existence in this frozen hellscape.
Historians still argue whether Hitler genuinely believed the Sixth Army could be supplied by air, or whether he simply didn't care, viewing the soldiers as expendable pawns in his ideological chess game with Stalin. Hermann Goering promised that the Luftwaffe could deliver 300 tons of supplies daily to the encircled pocket. The reality? On the best days, maybe 100 tons arrived. Most days, far less. Do the math. 250,000 men, each needing roughly a kilogram of food per day just to avoid starvation, plus ammunition, medical supplies, fuel. The numbers never worked. They were never going to work. And somewhere in East Prussia, in the Wolf's Lair, Hitler knew this and gave the order anyway. Stand fast, no retreat. You fold the letter carefully and put it back in your coat pocket, next to your heart, where it might provide one more layer of insulation against the cold. Outside, the artillery has started up again. Soviet Katyusha rockets, the ones the soldiers call Stalin's organs because of the howling sound they make. You've learned to tell the difference between incoming and outgoing fire, between the whistle of a mortar and the crack of a sniper's rifle. These are skills nobody teaches you in training, survival knowledge written in blood and frozen earth. The bunker shudders, dust falls from the ceiling. Someone whispers a prayer in the darkness, and you close your eyes, not to sleep, but because keeping them open requires energy you don't have. Tomorrow, you'll write another letter home. Tomorrow, you'll lie again about how things are going. Tomorrow, you'll pretend you still believe in rescue. But tonight, in this moment, in this frozen tomb of a city, you're just trying to make it to dawn. You remember September like it was someone else's life. Back then, you were unstoppable. Back then, the Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus was a machine built for conquest, 330,000 men strong, with tank divisions that could punch through Soviet lines like tissue paper. You crossed the Don River with bands playing and officers confident enough to write home about being in Stalingrad by week's end. The city was supposed to fall in 72 hours. That's what the intelligence officers said anyway, standing over their maps with rulers and pencils, drawing neat lines that had nothing to do with reality. The initial assault on August 23rd was textbook Blitzkrieg. The Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet, over 1,000 aircraft, turned the sky black and Stalingrad into an inferno. You watched from kilometers away as the city burned, smoke columns rising so high they seemed to pierce the clouds. Incendiary bombs designed to maximize civilian casualties did exactly that. Estimates suggest 40,000 Soviet citizens died in that first day alone, trapped in buildings that became ovens, fleeing through streets where the asphalt melted beneath their feet. Here's the dark irony nobody tells you. That bombing was tactically stupid. By reducing Stalingrad to rubble, the Luftwaffe created the perfect defensive terrain for the Soviets. Every collapsed building became a fortress. Every pile of bricks became cover. You turned a city into a maze of death, and then you walked right in. By early September, you're fighting block by block, sometimes room by room. The Soviets have a saying, every German soldier must kill a Russian, but there is always one more Russian. You're starting to understand what that means.
You take a factory in the morning, lose it by afternoon, retake it at night, then lose it again at dawn. There's a grain elevator, just a grain elevator, the kind of agricultural building you'd walk past without noticing back home. That takes 3 days to capture and costs hundreds of lives. 3 days for a building where people used to store wheat. Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffman kept a diary that survived the battle, and his September entries radiate confidence bordering on arrogance. He writes about the excellent rations, about swimming in the Volga, which, let's be honest, seems wildly optimistic given that people are actively shooting at the Volga, about how the Russians are barbarians who'll crumble any day now. Hoffman is 24 years old and absolutely certain he'll be home for Christmas. Spoiler alert, Hoffman doesn't make it home for Christmas. Hoffman doesn't make it home at all. But in September, none of you know that yet. In September, you're still writing letters about victory. You're assigned to clear the factory district, a cluster of industrial complexes called the Krasnaya Barrikady, Red Barricade, Lazur Chemical Plant, and the Dzerzhinsky Tractor Factory. These aren't just factories, they're fortresses where Soviet workers and soldiers fight side by side, where women operate anti-aircraft guns and teenagers throw Molotov cocktails from windows. The tractor factory is particularly nightmarish because it's still producing T-34 tanks even as you're fighting through it. Picture this absurdity. Workers assembling tanks on one floor while soldiers fight hand-to-hand on the floor below. The tanks roll straight off the assembly line into battle, sometimes without paint, sometimes without gun sights, driven by factory workers who learned to operate them approximately 5 minutes earlier. Here's a quirky detail that sounds invented but isn't. Soviet soldiers discovered that the best close-quarters weapon isn't a rifle or even a submachine gun. It's a sharpened spade, an entrenching tool, the kind of thing you dig latrines with. In the tight corridors of Stalingrad's ruins, where you're fighting at arm's length, a man with a spade can split a skull before you chamber another round. You learn this the hard way when Mueller from your squad gets his throat opened by a Russian sergeant wielding gardening equipment. It's the kind of death that doesn't make it into the heroic narratives. Killed by a shovel in a basement, bleeding out on concrete, while the man who killed you takes your ammunition and moves on. Historians still argue whether the Soviet decision to defend Stalingrad street by street was military genius or desperate improvisation. Stalin's Order No. 227, not one step back, eliminated retreat as an option. Barrier troops were positioned behind Soviet lines with orders to shoot anyone falling back without authorization. It's a brutal calculus. Men fight harder when the enemy is in front and their own officers are behind with machine guns. General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the 62nd Army defending Stalingrad, developed the tactic of hugging the enemy, staying so close to German lines that you can't call in artillery or air support without hitting your own men. You're 20 meters from Soviet positions, sometimes 10, sometimes close enough to hear them breathing. You're 20 meters from Soviet positions, sometimes 10, sometimes close enough to hear them breathing. By late September, the optimism is cracking. Your supply lines are stretching thin. Every truck that brings ammunition to the front has to run a gauntlet of Soviet artillery and partisan ambushes. The Luftwaffe controls the skies, sure, but controlling the sky doesn't mean much when the battle is happening in sewers and basements. You're learning that modern warfare, with all its tanks and planes, can be reduced to something medieval, men with knives fighting in the dark. You take a moment during a lull in the fighting, and lull means only sporadic sniper fire instead of constant artillery, to write home. You tell your father about the bravery of your comrades. You tell your sister that Stalingrad is almost secured. You tell your fiancé that you're counting the days until you can hold her again. You don't tell them that you sleep in 2-hour increments. You don't tell them that your hand shakes so badly from exhaustion you can barely hold the pen. You don't tell them that you've stopped learning the names of replacement troops because they usually die within 48 hours, and learning names makes burying them harder.
The censors will read this letter before it's sent. They'll make sure you haven't included anything that might damage morale back home. No mentions of casualties, no doubts about the Führer's strategy, nothing that contradicts the official narrative of inevitable German victory. So you self-censor, writing the letter you're supposed to write, rather than the letter you want to write. The truth stays in your head, where it metastasizes into something uglier with each passing day. September ends with the Sixth Army controlling roughly 90% of Stalingrad. 90%. That sounds good, right? That sounds like victory is a matter of mopping up the last few pockets of resistance. But here's what 90% control actually means. The Soviets still hold a strip of land along the Volga, sometimes only a few hundred meters deep, resupplied at night by boats braving German fire. And from that strip, they launch counterattacks that bleed you dry. You've learned the horrifying reality of urban warfare. Controlling 90% of a city means controlling nothing at all if your enemy refuses to quit. The nights are getting colder. You notice this because you're still sleeping in the open, in cellars and foxholes, without proper winter clothing because headquarters assumed this would be over by now. The first frost comes in late September, just a light dusting that melts by noon. You look at it and laugh because it seems almost pretty, almost innocent. You don't know yet that frost is a warning. You don't know that winter in Russia is about to teach the Wehrmacht a lesson that will echo through military academies for the next 80 years. You think you're winning, but the city is swallowing you alive, one frozen block at a time. The Volga freezes in early November, and with it freezes any illusion that you're getting out of this alive. You watch the ice form from your position in the ruins of the Red October steel factory, sheets of white spreading across the water like a shroud being pulled over a corpse. It's beautiful in a terrible way, the kind of beauty that makes you forget for half a second that beauty out here is just another word for death. The Volga freezing means the Soviets can no longer resupply their forces by boats under cover of darkness. At least that's what your officers say, trying to spin this as good news. But you're not stupid. You know what else it means. You're now locked on the wrong side of the river with an enemy that has nothing left to lose. General Paulus has 250,000 men trapped in what military historians politely call the Kessel, the cauldron. Less politely, it's a pocket, a noose, a coffin with the lid slowly closing. The Soviet Operation Uranus launched on November 19th, a massive pincer movement that sliced through the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies protecting your flanks. The Romanians weren't cowards, they were just catastrophically under-equipped, fighting with weapons that might have been cutting-edge in 1918, but are antiques now. When 900 Soviet tanks hit their positions in a snowstorm, the front collapsed like wet cardboard. Within 4 days, the jaws closed behind you. You're encircled, surrounded, cut off. Pick your euphemism. They all mean the same thing. Here's what encirclement means in practical terms. No more supply convoys driving in with fresh ammunition and food. No more wounded being evacuated to field hospitals in the rear. No more rear at all, actually. Just a shrinking perimeter, getting smaller every day as the Soviets squeeze. The pocket is roughly 40 kilometers wide and 20 kilometers deep, an oval of frozen hell containing an entire army that suddenly realized it's on an island with no bridge home.
Your rations get cut immediately. What was already inadequate becomes laughable. You're down to 200 grams of bread per day. That's about 2 slices, plus whatever horse meat can be scavenged from animals that have either frozen to death or been killed by artillery. There are roughly 10,000 horses in the pocket when encirclement happens. By December, most of them will be eaten. By January, men will be fighting over the memories of horses. You learn to make soup from bones you've already boiled 3 times. You learn that hunger isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself with stomach pangs after a while. It just makes you cold and stupid and gray. The Luftwaffe promises salvation. Hermann Göring, Reich Marshal and commander of the German Air Force, assures Hitler that he can supply the Sixth Army by air. He needs to deliver 300 tons daily. That's the minimum to keep 250,000 men alive and fighting. On the best day of the airlift, the Luftwaffe managed 289 tons. Most days hover around 100 tons. Some days, when blizzards ground the transport planes or Soviet fighters swarm the air corridors, nothing arrives at all. You do the math in your head, the kind of arithmetic that used to be abstract in school, but is now the difference between living and dying. 100 tons divided by 250,000 men equals starvation in slow motion.
Historians still argue whether Goering genuinely believed his own promise or was simply telling Hitler what he wanted to hear. The operational requirements were impossible. The Luftwaffe would need to fly 1,000 sorties in perfect conditions just to meet minimum supply needs. And conditions in southern Russia in winter are anything but perfect. The transport planes, mostly Ju-52s, lumbering 3-engine workhorses, have to fly through Soviet anti-aircraft fire, land on makeshift airstrips that are really just frozen fields, unload in minutes while under potential artillery bombardment, then fly back out. Losses are catastrophic. By the end of the siege, the Luftwaffe will lose 488 aircraft trying to supply an army that was doomed from the moment the pocket closed. You watch the planes come in, the ones that make it. They land heavily on the Pitnik airfield, engines whining, and you're assigned to unloading duty, which is almost funny because there's so little to unload. You open crates expecting ammunition and find propaganda leaflets. You open containers hoping for medical supplies and find summer uniforms, as if someone in logistics thought you were fighting in Greece instead of Russia. One plane arrives carrying 20 tons of marjoram and pepper. Marjoram. You're eating your boots, and headquarters sends you seasoning. The disconnect between Berlin's understanding and your reality is so vast it becomes darkly comedic, the kind of joke you'd laugh at if you had the energy for laughter.
The cold intensifies. November's chill was just foreplay. December brings temperatures that drop to -30, -40 on bad nights. Your standard-issue greatcoat designed for German winters is useless. You stuff newspaper inside your uniform for insulation. You wrap your feet in burlap and rags because your boots are falling apart and there are no replacements. Frostbite becomes as dangerous as Soviet bullets. Men lose toes, fingers, ears. The extremities go first, flesh turning black and dead while you're still using it. The field hospitals are overwhelmed with frostbite cases, and the doctors have a brutal triage system. If you can still hold a rifle, you're sent back to the line. Only the completely incapacitated get to stay in the warmth of a tent that's maybe 5 degrees warmer than outside. Lieutenant Hoffman's diary entries changed dramatically in November. Gone is the bravado, replaced by stark observations. Our regiment has lost half its men without gaining a meter of ground. Then, the horses have already been eaten. I would eat a cat now if I saw one, but the cats have disappeared. Then, most tellingly, we have been betrayed. The men are saying this openly now. Even the officers don't contradict them anymore. Hoffman will die in January, probably of typhus. But his diary survives him, smuggled out by a chaplain and eventually published in Germany decades later as testimony to what really happened in Stalingrad.
You're positioned in the northern sector of the pocket, near the tractor factory you fought so hard to capture in September. That victory seems like ancient history now. The Soviets are probing your lines constantly, testing for weakness, and they're finding it because your lines are mostly weakness at this point. Exhausted men, spread too thin, holding positions with ammunition they're rationed to conserve. You're told not to fire unless you have a clear kill shot. Every bullet counts now. Every shell is precious. You're waging a rich man's war with a pauper's supplies. At night, you hear Soviet loudspeakers broadcasting across no man's land. Sometimes it's music, German songs, folk tunes from home, calculated to make you homesick. Sometimes it's propaganda in German. Surrender and you'll be fed. Your officers have abandoned you. Stalin is merciful to prisoners who cooperate. You know it's psychological warfare, but you also know they're not entirely wrong. You have been abandoned. The officers might not say it, but you can see it in their faces, in the way Paulus looks at his maps like a man studying a death certificate. The Volga's frozen surface becomes a highway for Soviet reinforcements. At night, under cover of darkness, they march across the ice bringing supplies and fresh troops to the defenders still fighting in Stalingrad's ruins. You can't stop them. You don't control the riverbank anymore, and your artillery is rationed to near uselessness. Every advantage you had is evaporating. The pocket shrinks daily, contracting like a dying heart. You write another letter home, though mail is no longer leaving the pocket, except on the few evacuation flights reserved for the critically wounded. You write it anyway, because writing feels like doing something, like maintaining a connection to the world outside this frozen hell. You tell your mother you're well. You tell your brother to take care of the family business. You don't tell them you're trapped. You don't tell them you're starving. You don't tell them that every night you fall asleep wondering if you wake up, and every morning you wake up wondering why you bothered. The ice on the Volga thickens, and with it thickens the certainty settling over the pocket like snow. You're not leaving Stalingrad. Stalingrad is leaving you, one frozen day at a time. You sit down to write the letter you've been avoiding for weeks. It's December now, maybe the 8th or 9th. You've lost track because dates don't matter anymore. Only whether it's light or dark, whether you're being shelled or not. The paper is precious, rationed like everything else, and your hand shakes so badly from cold and hunger that your handwriting looks like a child's. You're writing to your mother in Munich, and you're about to lie with an expertise that would have horrified the person you used to be. Dear Muddy, you begin. I hope this finds you and Father well. The winter here is challenging, but our spirits remain high. Spirits remain high. That's good. The man to your left has dysentery so bad he can barely stand. Yesterday, Schmidt shot himself in the foot, probably on purpose, hoping for evacuation. But there are no more evacuations for foot wounds. He'll likely lose the leg to gangrene and die here anyway. You write, the food is adequate and we are well supplied. This is the lie censors want to see, the lie that keeps morale intact back home. The truth is you ate your last bread yesterday morning and won't see more until tomorrow, if the supply drop comes, which it probably won't. The truth is you boiled leather from an abandoned boot last week, and the soup tasted like industrial chemicals and despair. Here's what people don't understand about wartime correspondence. Letters that made it home from Stalingrad were triple-filtered lies. First, you censored yourself because you didn't want to worry family. Second, unit censors redacted anything violating operational security or damaging morale. Third, Goebbels' propaganda ministry intercepted letters at postal hubs, pulling anything too honest for review, code for incineration. Corporal Kurowski wrote home in December, "We are dying by the thousands, and the generals do nothing." That letter never left Stalingrad. Neither did Kurowski. I think of you often, especially during the quiet moments. Quiet moments, almost funny because they don't exist. There's always artillery in the distance, always someone coughing themselves to death from pneumonia, always wind howling through shell holes. But you write it because it sounds peaceful, because it allows your mother to imagine you somewhere warm, pensively thinking of home, instead of huddling in a frozen crater, trying to remember what warmth felt like. The Wehrmacht's postal service is remarkably efficient under normal circumstances. Letters from the Eastern Front typically reach Germany in 5 to 7 days. But these aren't normal circumstances. The pocket has maybe 2 airfields still operational, prioritized for ammunition and medical supplies, not mail. Your letter might leave on an evacuation flight if there's room, which means if there aren't enough wounded to fill the plane. There are always more wounded than aircraft, so you're writing to a mother who won't read these words for months, if ever. Historians still argue about how much German civilians actually knew about Stalingrad's reality. Official communiques spoke of heroic defense and temporary supply difficulties, language suggesting challenges without admitting catastrophe. Letters eventually arrived, ones written in November before full horror set in, ones that cleared censorship because they contained hope. By January, when truly desperate letters were written, most never made it out. You write about camaraderie, about how men look after each other. This part is sorta true. You do look after each other the way drowning men cling to driftwood, desperation masquerading as solidarity. When young Hoffman got typhus last week, you and Schmidt took turns sitting with him because nobody should die alone. He died anyway. They always die. But you held his hand while he hallucinated about his mother's kitchen. You don't write about that. You don't write about taking his ration card before his body was cold. There's strange arithmetic to survival nobody teaches in training. One man's death equals one extra ration, equals maybe one more day of life. The pocket started with 250,000 men. Every death shrinks the denominator, marginally improving odds for survivors. It's hideous calculus, the kind of thinking that would have revolted you in September, but December has burned away your capacity for moral luxury. You write, "Please send my love to Greta and tell her I'm counting the days." Greta is your fiancée, a school teacher in Heidelberg with dark hair and a laugh that sounds like summer. You haven't thought about her in weeks because thinking about her hurts worse than the cold, worse than hunger. Thinking about Greta means acknowledging what you're losing, and acknowledgement is a luxury you can't afford. A quirky detail from collected correspondence. Soldiers became obsessed with describing food in letters home. Not food they were eating, too depressing, but remembered meals, childhood dinners, holiday feasts. Entire paragraphs dedicated to their mother's sauerbraten or grandmother's apple strudel. Psychologists concluded it was a coping mechanism, mentally escaping starvation through culinary nostalgia. You close, "Your loving son, always." You fold it carefully and add it to the pile of mail that may or may not ever leave this frozen pocket. There are maybe 200 letters there, each one a small lie wrapped in desperate love. Father Hoffman comes by to collect mail. He's a Jesuit priest who volunteered for the Eastern Front, believing soldiers needed spiritual comfort. Now he looks like a scarecrow, cassock hanging on a frame that's lost 40 pounds. He takes your letter without comment and moves on. That night, you dream of your mother reading your letter. She's in the kitchen you grew up in, winter sunlight streaming through the window, crying but also smiling because the letter says you're fine, you're safe, you're coming home. Then you wake to darkness and cold and someone screaming, and you realize the cruelest thing you've done isn't shooting enemy soldiers, it's sending that letter, giving your mother hope when hope is just prolonged grief. You lie to the people you love because the truth would kill them, but the lies are killing you instead. Christmas, 1942, arrives in Stalingrad like a cruel joke, wrapped in frozen bandages and tied with barbed wire. You're in what used to be a department store basement. The Russians sold shoes here once, ladies' fashion, maybe children's toys. Now it's a bunker housing 40 men from various shattered units, thrown together by the random violence of encirclement. Someone has attempted festivity, a scraggly branch stuck in an ammunition box decorated with strips of aluminum foil from destroyed aircraft. It's the saddest Christmas tree in human history, and you can't stop staring at it. The rations for Christmas Day are special, which is Wehrmacht code for slightly less catastrophic than usual. You receive 200 grams of horse meat, actual meat, not just bone soup, plus your standard bread ration and, miracle of miracles, a single cigarette. The cigarette is worth more than the food. You could trade it for double rations, maybe triple if you find someone desperate enough. But you don't trade it. You smoke it slowly, savoring each drag like it's oxygen itself, and for 30 seconds you feel almost human again. Goebbels has arranged for radio broadcasts to reach the front. Christmas messages from the Führer assuring you that relief is coming, that your sacrifice matters, that Germany remembers her heroes. You listen to Hitler's voice crackling through a battery-powered radio someone managed to keep working, and you watch the faces around you. Nobody believes it anymore. Even Hoffman, young, naive Hoffman who believed everything until belief killed him, even he stopped believing before the typhus took him. The radio says relief columns are fighting their way toward you. The radio is lying. There was a relief attempt actually. Operation Winter Storm, launched December 12th under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, trying to punch through Soviet lines and reach the pocket. Army Group Hoth got within 48 kilometers of Stalingrad, close enough that you could theoretically walk there in a day if you weren't surrounded by 3 Soviet armies. Paulus was ordered to break out and link up with the relief force, a maneuver called Operation Thunderclap. He refused, or rather, Hitler refused on his behalf, still insisting that the 6th Army hold its position. By December 23rd, the relief attempt collapsed. Manstein's forces retreated. The jaws stayed closed. Historians still argue whether Paulus could have saved more men by disobeying orders and attempting the breakout anyway. The consensus is probably not. By mid-December, the 6th Army was too weak, too starved, too frozen to execute a coordinated fighting retreat through 48 kilometers of Soviet-held territory. Most men would have died on the march, but some might have made it. Some is better than none, and none is what you're looking at now. Somebody starts singing Stille Nacht, Silent Night. The song is in German, obviously, but you remember the history lesson from school. It was written in Austria in 1818, first performed in a small church on Christmas Eve. Now it's being performed in a bombed-out Russian basement by men who smell like death and look like skeletons. The singing is ragged, voices cracking from cold and malnutrition, but it continues. Schlaf in himmlischer Ruhe, sleep in heavenly peace. You wonder if any of you will ever sleep in peace again, heavenly or otherwise. The man next to you is crying silently, tears freezing on his cheeks before they can fall. His name is Weber, and you know from conversations that he has 3 children back in Stuttgart, 2 boys and a girl. He's looking at a photograph, edges worn from constant handling, showing his family in their Sunday clothes. You don't ask if he's okay because that's a stupid question. Nobody's okay. Instead, you put your hand on his shoulder, a gesture so small it's almost meaningless, but he nods at you and you nod back, and somehow that's enough. Here's a quirky detail that sounds invented but isn't. The Luftwaffe attempted to drop Christmas packages into the pocket. Special containers filled with holiday treats, chocolate, cigarettes, schnapps, even letters from German school children wishing the soldiers well. Most containers landed in Soviet-controlled territory or burst open on impact, scattering luxuries into the snow where they were immediately looted or destroyed. Your unit received exactly 1 container. Inside were 20 Christmas cards from a girls' school in Bremen, each one carefully hand-drawn with snowflakes and angels, each one signed by a child who had no idea that her card would be read by men who were already ghosts. You read one of the cards. It's from a girl named Liesel, age 9, who writes in careful script that she hopes you like the drawing of a reindeer and that you come home soon to your family. The reindeer is actually pretty good. She's got talent. You fold the card carefully and put it in your pocket, next to the letter from your mother that you've read so many times the paper is starting to disintegrate. You'll never meet Liesel. She'll grow up in a Germany that loses the war, that gets divided, that eventually reunifies. She'll be an old woman before anyone tells the full truth about Stalingrad. But for now, her reindeer sits in your pocket, a tiny monument to innocence in a place where innocence came to die. The Christmas meal is served around 8 p.m. Horse meat boiled into a stew with melted snow and whatever vegetation someone scraped from under the ice. It tastes like sadness and iron, but is hot, which is more valuable than flavor. You eat slowly, making it last, because this is the best meal you'll have for weeks. Around you, men eat in silence, the only sound the scraping of spoons against tin cups and the occasional cough that sounds like something tearing inside someone's chest. Father Hoffman attempts a Christmas Mass. He has no altar, no vestments beyond his filthy cassock, no communion wine or wafers. But he goes through the motions anyway, reciting the liturgy from memory in Latin that most men don't understand, but find comfort in anyway. Because ritual is comforting, because pretending there's order and meaning is better than accepting there's only chaos and cold. He speaks about the birth of Christ in Bethlehem, about hope and salvation, about how God sees all suffering and keeps accounts. You want to believe him. You want to believe there's a cosmic ledger where your suffering earns you something, where freezing to death in a Russian basement counts towards some kind of eternal reward. But you don't believe it. You stopped believing in divine justice around the same time you stopped believing in German victory, which was around the same time you started eating leather. If God is watching Stalingrad, he's either powerless or cruel, and neither option is particularly comforting.
After Mass, someone produces a mouth organ, a harmonica, battered and probably looted from a corpse, and plays German folk songs. O Tannenbaum, Es ist ein Ros entsprungen, songs you learned as a child, songs that now sound like they're being played at a funeral, which, in a way, they are. You're attending your own funeral, listening to the songs that will be sung at the memorial services back home when the telegrams finally arrive. We regret to inform you. The temperature outside is -35. Inside the basement, it's maybe -20. Men huddle together for warmth, pressed so close you can feel hearts beating through layers of filthy uniforms. This is intimacy without affection, survival without dignity. You sleep sitting up because lying down means you might not wake up. Body heat escapes faster horizontally, and you've already seen too many men close their eyes and simply not open them again. You dream of Christmas at home, your mother's kitchen, the smell of roasting goose and red cabbage, your father carving the meat with ceremonial precision, your sister laughing at something, candles on the tree, real candles, not this aluminum foil mockery. In the dream, you're warm. In the dream, you're full. In the dream, you're alive in a way that matters beyond the simple biological fact of your heart still beating. You wake to darkness and someone shaking you because it's your turn for watch duty. 2 hours standing at the basement entrance with a rifle you're not supposed to fire unless absolutely necessary because ammunition is too precious to waste on anything less than a direct assault. You stumble to your post, wrap your arms around yourself, and stare out at the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. Somewhere in the distance, you hear Soviet soldiers singing their own Christmas songs. Orthodox Christmas is January 7th, but they're singing anyway, their voices carrying across no man's land like messages from another world. You wonder if they're cold too. You wonder if they're hungry. Probably. War makes everyone hungry and cold. The only difference is they're winning, and you're not. This is Christmas 1942 in Stalingrad, a holiday celebrated in hell by men who are already dead but haven't stopped moving yet.
The letters you write after Christmas are different. You can feel it in the way your pen moves across the paper, the way words come harder now, like you're trying to speak a language you're forgetting. It's early January 1943, and the pocket has shrunk again. Soviet forces are pressing from all sides, squeezing the Kessel tighter each day. The perimeter that was 40 kilometers wide in November is maybe 20 now, and getting smaller. You're running out of Russia to stand on. But more than that, you're running out of lies to tell. The censorship apparatus is breaking down, because everything is breaking down. There aren't enough officers left to read every letter, and even if there were, what's the point? The truth is obvious now. No relief is coming. No miracle will save you. The Sixth Army is dying in installments, and everyone knows it. So when you sit down to write home this time, you make a decision that would have been unthinkable in November. You're going to tell the truth. Not all of it. Some things are too horrific to burden your mother with, but enough. Enough that if this letter somehow makes it out, if it somehow reaches Munich, she'll know. She'll understand what happened here. Dear Mutti, you begin, and then you pause, because the next words are heavy, because once you write them down, they become real in a way they weren't before. I need you to know that I may not be coming home. There, you've said it. The ink is barely dry and already you want to cross it out, want to return to the comfortable fiction of temporary setbacks and eventual victory. But you don't. You let it stand.
This is where history gets complicated, because the Nazis did something both brilliant and monstrous in January 1943. They announced that soldiers in Stalingrad could write one final uncensored letter home, a last letter, though they didn't call it that officially. The propaganda value was obvious. Let the soldiers write their goodbyes, let them say they died believing in the Führer and the Reich, let their families receive these testimonies of unshaken faith. What Goebbels didn't anticipate was that some soldiers would use this opportunity to tell the truth. Not many, most still self-censored, still tried to spare their families, but some wrote with brutal honesty about the starvation, the cold, the abandonment. These letters became some of the most damning documents of the Nazi regime's callousness. You write, "We have not received adequate supplies in weeks. Many men are sick. The cold is beyond anything I can describe." Inadequate supplies, that's putting it mildly. Yesterday's ration was 75 grams of bread, barely more than a dinner roll, and a cup of soup that was mostly hot water with a rumor of horse fat. Men are dying of starvation now, not even from wounds or disease, just from their bodies consuming themselves because there's nothing else left to consume. You've lost maybe 30 pounds since November. You can feel your ribs through your uniform. Your face in the broken mirror looks like a skull with skin stretched over it.
A peculiar phenomenon has started occurring that medical officers initially couldn't explain. Men are developing night blindness. They can see normally during the day, or as normally as exhausted, starving men can see. But once darkness falls, they're functionally blind, stumbling around like they're underwater. It took someone with medical training to figure it out. Severe vitamin A deficiency. No vegetables, no dairy, no liver. Nothing that contains the nutrients human eyes need to function. So now you have soldiers who can't see in the dark, trying to hold defensive positions at night, and the results are predictably disastrous. The Soviets have figured this out too. Their attacks increasingly come after sunset. You write, "I think of home constantly. I think of your kitchen and the garden in summer. I think of Father's workshop and the smell of sawdust. I think of Sunday mornings and church bells." This is both true and tactical. If censors do somehow review this letter, nostalgia is permissible, even encouraged. It makes good propaganda, the brave soldier sustained by memories of the fatherland. What you don't write is that these memories are becoming less vivid, less real. You try to picture your mother's face, and the details are fuzzy now, like a photograph left in sunlight too long. You're forgetting what warm feels like. You're forgetting what full feels like. You're forgetting how to be human, instead of just a survival mechanism wrapped in rotting cloth.
Historians still argue about how many last letters actually made it out of Stalingrad. The numbers vary wildly. Some sources say 20,000, others suggest closer to 40,000. What's certain is that most were never sent. They were collected by chaplains and officers who promised they'd be mailed, but the logistics were impossible. There weren't enough planes, and the planes that did make it out were prioritized for wounded officers, not mailbags. So thousands of letters sat in sorting stations in the pocket, then got abandoned when those stations were overrun, then were captured by Soviet forces, who eventually sent some of them back to Germany after the war as evidence of Nazi crimes. Imagine that, writing a final letter to your mother and having it delivered by the enemy 20 years later to a woman who's already mourned you, already buried an empty coffin, already learned to live with your absence. You write, "If something happens to me, please know that I was thinking of you at the end. Please know that I tried to be brave. Please tell Greta." And here you stop, because what do you tell Greta? That you loved her? She knows that. That you wanted to marry her, have children, grow old together?
She knows that too. That you're sorry for dying in a frozen wasteland for a cause you no longer believe in? That seems cruel, putting that burden on her. So you leave it vague. Please tell Greta that she made me happy. Past tense. You've already accepted that you're writing from the past to people who will read this in a future where you no longer exist.
The act of writing this letter takes 3 hours because your hands are shaking from cold and weakness, because you keep stopping to think, because putting certain things into words makes them irrevocable. Around you, other men are writing their own last letters. Weber is crying openly, not even trying to hide it anymore. Young Keller, just 19, looks about 12 now with his hollow cheeks and 1,000-yard stare, is writing to parents who probably still think of him as a child. He is a child. You're all children, playing at soldiers, dying in a game whose rules nobody explained properly. There's a strange intimacy in this moment. 40 men in a basement, all writing goodbye letters by candlelight, that makes the shadows dance on the walls like ghosts rehearsing. Nobody speaks. The only sounds are pen scratching paper, the occasional sob someone can't quite suppress, the distant artillery that never really stops, just becomes background noise like breathing or heartbeat. You're writing your own eulogy, and so is everyone else. And there's something almost peaceful about it, the acceptance, the permission to acknowledge what you've all known for weeks.
You finish the letter, "Your loving son, always and forever." You fold it carefully, address it, and hand it to Father Hoffman, who's making his rounds, collecting the last letters like he's harvesting souls. He looks at you with eyes that have seen too much suffering to offer false comfort. He just nods, adds your letter to his satchel, and moves on. You wonder if he knows that he's probably going to die too, that his satchel full of final words will likely end up in a Soviet intelligence office rather than a German postal station. That night you don't dream of home. You dream of nothing at all, which is somehow worse than nightmares because it feels like practice for death, the absolute cessation of consciousness, the void that's waiting. You wake up gasping, not because of the dream, but because someone is shaking you, saying your name urgently. It's your turn for watch again, or maybe there is an attack, or maybe someone else has died and they need help moving the body outside before it freezes solid and becomes impossible to carry. You stumble to your feet, bones aching, joints protesting, and for a moment you can't remember why you're here, what you're fighting for, what any of this means. Then muscle memory takes over. You pick up your rifle, you move to your position, you do what you're told, because doing what you're told is easier than thinking. The letter is gone now, out of your hands, on its own journey. You've said your goodbyes, you've told your truth, or as much truth as you could bear to tell. Now there's nothing left to do but wait. For rescue that won't come, for spring that might come too late, for death that's coming regardless, patient and certain as the sunrise.
Rats become dinner around mid-January, and you're not even ashamed anymore. Shame is a luxury for people with full stomachs, and your stomach stopped being full sometime back in December. The rats in Stalingrad are fat, relatively speaking, because they've been feeding on things you try not to think about. Corpses, mostly. There are too many corpses and not enough frozen ground to bury them in, so they pile up in corners and alleyways, and the rats feast. Then you feast on the rats, which makes you part of a food chain so grotesque it would be funny if you had the energy for laughter. Catching a rat requires patience you didn't know you still possessed. You set crude traps using wire and bits of leather as bait. The rats are smart enough to avoid most traps, but hunger makes everything stupid eventually. Rats and men alike. When you catch one, you kill it quickly with a rock with the butt of your rifle, then skin it with a knife that's seen better days. The meat is stringy and tastes like whatever the rat was eating, which means it tastes like death. But you cook it over a small fire made from furniture scraps, and you eat it, and you're grateful. This is what you've become, a man grateful for rat meat.
Weber catches a rat that's bigger than the others, maybe half a kilogram, and he shares it with your group because sharing is the only thing keeping any of you human. You roast it on a stick like it's a campfire meal back home, like your children playing at survival instead of 30-year-old men actually surviving. The rat meat divides into portions so small they barely register, but you chew slowly, making it last, pretending each bite is filling a hole that can't be filled anymore.
Here's a detail that medical historians find fascinating. The human body can survive far longer without food than anyone expects, but it does so by cannibalizing itself in a specific order. First goes the fat. You had some in November, none by December. Then the body starts breaking down muscle tissue, converting protein into energy. Your muscles waste away, your heart weakens, because your heart is a muscle too. Your immune system collapses, because it needs resources to function, and there are no resources. By January, you're a skeleton with skin, a machine running on fumes, waiting for the final shutdown. Comrades become ghosts while you watch. Not metaphorically, literally. You watch men transform from human beings into haunted shells. Keller stops speaking entirely, just stares at nothing with eyes that don't blink often enough. Schmidt develops a cough that sounds like his lungs are tearing apart from the inside, and probably they are, because tuberculosis is spreading through the pocket like fire through paper. Weber still talks, but his words don't make sense anymore. He has conversations with people who aren't there, argues with his dead brother, proposes marriage to his wife for the third time, even though they've been married for 8 years. You're not sure you're doing much better. Yesterday, or maybe it was 2 days ago, time is slippery now, you spent an hour having a detailed conversation with your father about renovating the workshop, offering advice about which wood to use for the new shelves, debating the merits of different varnishes. Then you realized your father wasn't there. You were talking to a pile of rubble. The worst part is you continued the conversation anyway, because it felt good to talk about something normal, something that wasn't death and cold and hunger.
The Soviet forces are closing in methodically, not even bothering with major assaults anymore, because they know time is doing their work for them. Why waste ammunition when starvation and disease are killing you faster than bullets? They've divided the pocket into smaller sections, squeezing from multiple directions, and each day the perimeter shrinks. Potomnik Airfield falls on January 16th. You hear about it through the chain of command that's breaking down like everything else. Potomnik was the main supply lifeline. Now there's only Gumrak, and Gumrak is within artillery range, and everyone knows Gumrak won't last long. Historians still argue whether the Soviets deliberately prolonged the agony of Stalingrad's reduction or whether they were simply being cautious, having learned that cornered German forces could still fight fiercely. The truth is probably both. They wanted the propaganda value of a slow, grinding victory, wanted the world to see the Wehrmacht destroyed piece by piece, but they also knew that desperate men are dangerous. So they squeezed slowly, methodically, letting winter and hunger do most of the killing. You're on burial detail, which is darkly funny because there's no burying happening. The ground is frozen solid, and even if it weren't, there are too many corpses. You're really on corpse stacking detail, dragging frozen bodies to collection points where they're piled like cordwood, waiting for what? Nobody knows. Maybe when spring comes, if anyone's still alive, they'll deal with it then. The bodies are rigid, frozen in whatever position they died in, some curled up like they're sleeping, some with arms outstretched like they're reaching for something, some with expressions of surprise or pain, or, most unsettling, relief.
You recognize some of them. There's Lieutenant Becker, who used to quote Goethe and talk about becoming a teacher after the war. There's Corporal Steiner, who played that battered harmonica at Christmas. There's young Fischer, who couldn't have been more than 18, who cried for his mother in his sleep until sleep became permanent. You don't feel much looking at them. You should feel something. Grief, rage, horror, but there's nothing.
Emotional reserves are depleted like food reserves, like ammunition reserves, like hope reserves. You're running on empty in every possible way. A quirky medical detail that sounds invented but isn't. Men start losing their teeth. Not from poor hygiene, though hygiene is catastrophic, but from scurvy, vitamin C deficiency. Your gums swell and bleed, your teeth loosen and fall out. You've lost 2 molars so far. Just woke up one morning and they were gone. Found them in your mouth like loose change. Chewing becomes difficult, which is almost funny because there's barely anything to chew. The few men who've maintained medical training try to help, but what can they do? Scurvy requires fresh vegetables and citrus, and the last fresh anything was 3 months ago. You write another letter home, even though you know it won't leave the pocket, even though you've already written your last letter, because writing is the only thing that makes you feel connected to the world outside this frozen hell. You write, "I am still alive." 3 words. That's all you can manage today, because 3 words are the entire truth of your existence right now. Alive, but barely. Alive, but not living. Alive in the technical sense that your heart still beats and your lungs still draw breath. The temperature has dropped to -40. Men are dying in their sleep from hypothermia, just going to sleep and not waking up, which honestly seems like the preferable way to go at this point. Quick, painless, just sliding from one darkness into another. You've started sleeping pressed between 2 other men, sharing body heat, and in the morning you check them both to make sure they're still breathing before you move, because sometimes they're not, and you've spent the night pressed against a corpse. Father Hoffman conducts a funeral mass for 60 men who died in the past week. 60! That's just your immediate sector. Multiply that across the entire pocket, and you're looking at thousands dying weekly now. Not from combat, but from the slow grinding down of human endurance. The chaplain's voice is barely a whisper, damaged from cold and probably pneumonia, and he doesn't have the strength to project anymore. The men who attend, maybe 20 out of a unit that started with 200, stand swaying like trees in wind, barely able to remain upright. The homily is brief. God sees your suffering. God remembers. You wonder if that's supposed to be comforting. God sees you dying in a frozen basement for a cause you no longer believe in. God remembers you eating rats and losing your teeth and forgetting what your fiancé's laugh sounds like. And what? What does God do with that information? File it away for Judgment Day? Give you extra points in heaven? It seems like cold comfort, literally and figuratively.
That night, you dream of eating. Not specific food, just eating. The act of chewing and swallowing and feeling full. It's the most erotic dream you've had in months, more satisfying than any sexual fantasy, because hunger has replaced every other drive. When you wake, you're salivating and your stomach is cramping, and you realize you've been dreaming about food for so long that your body has started believing the dream is real, preparing for a meal that isn't coming. You check your pockets and find Liesel's Christmas card, the one with the reindeer. The paper is grimy now, edges torn, but the reindeer is still there, still smiling its crayon smile. You look at it for a long time, trying to remember what innocence felt like, trying to imagine a world where 9-year-old girls draw reindeer and soldiers come home and Christmas means something other than the day you ate horse meat in a frozen basement. You put the card back in your pocket, next to your heart, where it might provide one more layer of insulation. You're not sure why you keep it. Sentiment is expensive, and you can't afford expensive things anymore. But you keep it anyway, this small piece of paper from a world that might as well be another planet. A talisman against the darkness that's closing in from all sides. The rats scatter when you move. They know the routine now. Your competition, hunting the same scarce resources. You wonder if the rats will outlast you, if they'll feast on your frozen corpse the way they've feasted on everyone else's. Probably.
Rats are survivors. Humans, it turns out, are not.